Eastern Colorado, early spring 1996. 120 acres of semi-arid farm ground, flat and open under a wide sky, with pale white crust crawling across the low corners of nearly every field. Salt, rising up out of the soil itself, thick enough in places that it crunched underfoot like frost that never melted. Nobody wanted the place. 2 operators before Elias Reed had tried to farm it and walked away broke, one after the other, each one certain the answer was more water, more fertilizer, one more pass with the plow. 3 years later, trucks from a regional seed cooperative would be pulling in to load bagged, certified seed off that same white ground the bank had already written off twice before Elias ever set foot on it. Elias Reed was 51 that spring, a Kentucky man by raising, out in Colorado on a short-term arrangement with a small investment partner who held the lease and needed somebody who actually understood water to look the ground over before the bank finally gave up on it. He'd been divorced some years by then, no particular reason to stay put in Kentucky through a slow winter, and the arrangement paid enough to cover his costs while he figured out whether the ground was worth anything at all. If it wasn't, he'd go home in a season. If it was, he'd have proven something worth carrying back with him. 20-some years of county road work back home had taught Elias more about water than any classroom ever could. He knew ditches. He knew drainage. He knew that water problems weren't always about too little water. Sometimes they were about water moving something into the wrong place and leaving it there. He walked the 120 acres for the better part of a week before he ever talked numbers with the bank. He carried his old yellow surveyor's level, same as always, and a fresh notebook, and he didn't plant a single thing that first week. He mapped instead. Where the salt crust ran thickest, mostly the low ground, the same low ground where irrigation water, pulled from a shallow well the previous operators had relied on, had nowhere left to go once it evaporated, leaving every mineral it carried behind on the surface. Where a few tough wild plants still grew, thin and scrubby but alive, in patches that everything else around them refused to touch. Where the drainage simply stalled out, flat ground holding water just long enough for the sun to pull it back up and leave its salt behind, season after season, year after year, until the whole field turned white. He took soil samples to the extension office in town and got the numbers back a week later. Salinity readings in the worst sections ran high enough that the agent barely looked up from the page. Anything that's severe, he said, most crops wouldn't even germinate, let alone produce. The better ground, the higher push toward the property's edge, tested moderate, workable maybe with the right approach. The wind out there never really stopped, dry and steady across the flat ground, and Elias noticed it pulled moisture out of the soil faster than anything he'd ever farmed back in Kentucky. That was part of the problem, he realized, walking the property with his level and his notebook. Water came up out of the low ground through capillary action, evaporated fast in that dry wind, and left every mineral it had carried sitting right there on the surface. The salt wasn't coming from nowhere. It was being concentrated season after season by that same evaporation cycle, well water carrying its own natural mineral load, applied faithfully every summer, with nowhere for the salts to drain to once the water itself was gone. More water wasn't fixing that, not without somewhere for the salt to actually go. More water, applied the same way as always, was just feeding it. Elias signed a lease on the 120 acres for $1,800 a year, dirt cheap even by the standards of ground nobody wanted, with an option to buy outright if he could show the place could be made to pay. His first plan, that first year, was the plan everybody before him had tried. Better drainage. Flush the salts down and out with enough water, enough passes, enough patience, and get the worst 20 acres back into shape for a conventional crop. He put in new drainage tile on that block, tying it into an old irrigation ditch at the property's low corner so the flushed water would actually have somewhere to go, and ran extra irrigation through it all summer, trying to push the salts down below the root zone, spending close to $11,000 doing it. By fall, the salinity readings on that block had dropped, but only slightly. Nowhere near enough to justify what he'd spent, and nowhere close to what a normal wheat crop needed to produce anything worth harvesting. He stood at the edge of that flushed field that October, kicking at soil that still crunched white under his boot, and admitted the plan hadn't worked the way he'd hoped. $11,000 was most of what he'd set aside for the whole first year, and he'd spent almost all of it chasing a fix that had barely moved the needle. The bank's man, a loan officer named Roy Talbot, who'd watched 2 previous operators fail on that same ground, drove out not long after and told Elias plainly that he thought the smartest thing left to do was walk away and let the 120 acres sit idle, same as half the salt-damaged ground in the county already did. Roy wasn't cruel about it. He'd just seen the same story play out too many times to believe this one would end differently. A new operator coming in, convinced he could out-drain or out-fertilize a problem that decades of real farmers hadn't solved. Elias didn't argue with him directly. He just asked one question out loud, mostly to himself. What if the 120 acres didn't need to grow what everybody else was growing? That winter, Elias started reading everything he could find about crops that could actually tolerate saline ground instead of fighting it, the way farmers in genuinely salt-affected regions out west had been working the problem for years. He kept coming back to barley, specific salt-tolerant cultivars developed and tested for exactly this kind of ground, hardy enough to produce a real crop where wheat and corn simply gave up. It wasn't exotic. It wasn't a miracle plant. It was an existing, proven option that almost nobody around Elias had bothered to try, because almost nobody around Elias had stopped asking the ground to be something it wasn't. In year 2, Elias put in small test strips instead of committing the whole farm, half an acre here, a full acre there, spread across different zones of salinity he'd already mapped the year before. Some of it failed outright, planted a little too deep into the worst ground, salinity readings simply too severe for even a tolerant variety to establish. He walked those failed strips in June, plants yellowed and stunted, and crossed that zone off the notebook the same way he'd crossed off sections of a hillside or a bottomland field in every job before this one. But 2 of the strips, planted on the moderate ground toward the field's edge, came up thin at first, and then filled in steady through the season, heads forming, grain setting, a real stand where nothing had grown clean in years. He walked those rows most evenings that summer, half expecting to find the same yellowing he'd seen on the failed ground, and every time he found green instead. He harvested those test strips by hand that first season, weighing every bit of it on a borrowed scale, writing the numbers down in the same notebook he'd used to map the salt in the first place. It wasn't a large harvest. 19 bushels off just under 2 productive acres, nothing that would have impressed a conventional grain farmer anywhere in the county. It was proof. Word of a real stand of barley on that ground reached the extension office before Elias ever went looking for anybody. A regional seed cooperative, the kind that supplied certified seed stock to dryland farmers across 3 counties, had been fielding more calls every year from growers dealing with the same creeping salinity problem. Elias had bought into irrigation districts where the water table sat high and salty, dryland seeps where the same slow evaporation had been ruining fields for a generation. They didn't have much to offer those farmers besides the same tired advice. Drain it, flush it, give up on it. An agronomist from the cooperative drove out in year 3 to walk Elias's test strips himself, a quiet man named Frank Della, who spent more time crouched down looking at root systems than talking, and left with a question instead of a lecture. Would Elias be willing to grow certified seed under contract on the ground that had actually proven itself? Not a miracle crop, not a fortune, just clean, reliable seed stock from a variety that had already been developed and tested, grown by somebody who could prove it worked on real saline ground instead of a research plot 2 states away. Elias said yes. Year 3. He expanded the barley planting to 18 acres, but only on the moderate zones that had already outperformed his first test strips, better soil structure, lower salinity readings, and this time, uniform establishment from the start instead of the patchy stands he'd fought through in year 2. He kept the seed clean, roguing out anything that didn't perform, following the cooperative's protocols to the letter, walking the crop with a field inspector from the cooperative twice that summer to certify it before harvest, and that fall he delivered his first certified seed harvest, a little over 600 bushels, cleaned and bagged at the cooperative's own facility, at a contract price running nearly 40% above ordinary feed-grade barley, because certified seed for salt-tolerant ground was worth more to a farmer desperate for something that would actually grow. Roy Talbot came back out that fall too, not to talk about walking away this time, but because word had gotten around the bank that Elias was cutting a check to the county instead of the other way around. He stood at the edge of the field, watching a truck from the seed cooperative pull in to load bagged seed off a farm the bank had all but written off 3 years before. He didn't need Elias to explain much. The signed contract sitting on the truck's clipboard said everything Roy needed to hear. By year 4, Elias had 32 acres in certified seed production, split between 2 salt-tolerant barley varieties the cooperative wanted more of, plus a smaller trial block testing a salt-tolerant forage grass for ranchers dealing with the same saline seeps on their own pasture land. Total contract seed revenue that year came in just over $22,000 gross, against establishment and production costs that had settled down to a fraction of what he'd wasted trying to flush that first field back to conventional use. The 120 acres, most of it still too saline for anything but the toughest forage, had become one of the cooperative's more reliable small seed suppliers on marginal ground. Not because every acre produced, but because the acres that could produce were doing exactly what the ground was suited for. He never did buy out the lease on the worst 40 acres, the ground that stayed too salty to plant anything at all. He didn't need to. That ground wasn't failing him anymore. It just wasn't being asked to do a job it was never built for. Frank Della came back out one more time that 4th fall, walking the productive blocks slower than he needed to, the way a man does when he's checking work he already trusts. He asked Elias what he'd tell the next farmer sitting on ground like this, staring at a banknote and a field full of white crust. Elias thought about it a while before he answered. "Stop trying to make the salt disappear," he said. "Start asking what still wants to grow in it." Late that 4th summer, Elias walked out past that worst patch one evening, salt still crusted white and visible where nothing grew, same as it had the day he first mapped it. He didn't try to fix it. He'd stopped trying to fix it years before. He'd stopped asking how to make bad ground normal and started asking what the ground could still do well.